Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. Montana, late July, 1867. In the oppressive heat of a large buffalo hide lodge, a group of Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors and chiefs beat a large war drum and chant their war songs with all the gusto they could muster as their energy wanes after hours spent at their task. Around them are packed dozens of other warriors, making an already unseasonably warm day nearly unbearable inside the cramped confines of the lodge. The smell of smoke and sweat permeate the air. In the middle of the lodge, circling the center, are a group of several young warriors, all with the skin of their chests pierced on either side by thick leather cordage. Thoroughly exhausted from hours of dancing, chanting, and blood loss, the warriors occasionally suspend the entirety of their body weight from the cordage, stretching every sinew to its absolute limit in their pursuit of spiritual favor. To an unsuspecting bystander, the macabre scene would seem a bizarre, if not repulsive stunt, perhaps akin to some kind of Old West avant-garde performance art. But to the assembled warriors, the matter at hand is a deeply spiritual and critically necessary endeavor in the fate of their peoples. Their intent is to both curry favor with their Great Spirit and to, at least in some sense, divine that Spirit's intentions. This they did through the incitement of visions, be that through fasting, dancing, chanting, or some combination therein. Though their wounds will all, generally, be superficial, the sight and stench of gore do indeed present a nearly overwhelming spectacle. But the ceremony is meant to be gruesome, for they are nations at war. And as the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe are all too aware, war is a gruesome business. Now that the white man's great war in the East has seemingly finished, the Bluecoats are again invading the areas they had sworn not to a decade and a half earlier. Though the United States government had agreed to terms with the tribes in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, the advent of mass westward expansion after the Civil War has necessitated greater and greater incursions into that territory that, by law, is not theirs. The year prior, the legendary Sioux chief Red Cloud had begun to wage a campaign of tactical and strategic brilliance against the U.S. Army in their attempts to both escort settlers as well as man the system of forts they had constructed throughout the plains. On December 21st of 1866, though he was not present at the battle due to a wound suffered on a raid against the Sioux's hated enemy, the Crow, Red Cloud's forces had destroyed a large contingent of U.S. cavalry soldiers under the command of Captain William J. Fetterman. The resulting defeat was the most costly suffered by the United States Army on the plains until a full decade later at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The force of roughly 1,000 warriors, which included future legends such as Crazy Horse and American Horse, laid waste to every single member of the 81-man patrol in desperate, bloody, hand-to-hand combat. As was custom in Northern Plains warfare, as both a deterrent and a punishment, the bodies of the slain had been horribly mutilated and left for their comrades to find. Colonel Henry B. Carrington, the commanding officer of the fort during the Fetterman massacre, led a contingent of cavalry troops out to find the remains of the fallen the day after the fight. Carrington's account of what he and his troops found could be descriptive of the aftermath of countless encounters between U.S. troops and native tribes on the open plains. We found their eyes torn out and laid on rocks, noses cut off, ears cut off, chins hewn off, entrails taken out and exposed, hands cut off, feet cut off, arms taken out from socket, private parts severed and indecently placed on the person. Such viscerally disturbing sights would forever haunt the dreams of those who had been present that day, and endured the gory task of burying the brutalized remains of their comrades in the icy, hard ground of the Wyoming frontier. A heroic ride had been made by one Manuel Felipe Cardozo, also known as John Phillips or Portuguese Phillips, in the midst of a blizzard from Fort Phil Kearny to Fort Laramie, where the commanding officer, Colonel Ennis Palmer, was informed of the defeat and reinforcements were marshaled. But while such tragic losses were avoided by the Army during the spring and vast majority of the summer, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe had continued to harass travelers on the Bozeman Trail, as well as civilian woodcutting and hay-gathering details that had served as critical support lifelines for the fort. Now, as the summer season for hunting and making war comes into full swing, the tribes gathered here at the Sundance on the sweltering Montana plains intend to divine their next target with the help of both their Great Spirit and the direction of the war chief who has so brilliantly led them in the preceding months, Red Cloud. Now, it is determined that the next focal point of their ire will be the civilian work details of Fort C.F. Smith and Fort Phil Kearny. In classic guerrilla warfare strategy, Red Cloud intends not to attack the strongholds of the fort, but rather to strike at their most vulnerable elements when and where they present themselves as targets. It is determined that, in just a few weeks' time, the warriors of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe now gathered here for the Sundance will resume their terrorizing of the U.S. Army forts, and they will not stop until the U.S. Army and all the white men are gone from their territory for good. On the morning of August 1, 1867, the warriors rise hours before dawn to complete their pre-raid rituals. Horses and bodies are painted, weapons are checked and rechecked, prayers are offered, and water is consumed nearly to the point of nauseation in preparation for the long, hot day ahead. Miles away, just as dawn begins to break, the soldiers and civilians ensconced within the walls of Fort C.F. Smith are busy readying themselves for another day of hard labor in the unremitting summer heat. As the inhabitants of the fort hurriedly consume breakfasts of hardtack and black coffee, they nervously eye the rolling countryside outside of the fort's walls. In the hue of the new dawn glow, the scene is sparse, beautiful, and deceptively placid. But as they make small talk and finish their breakfasts, every man knows that a very real danger lies out there, somewhere on the open plains. However, the option to simply hunker down inside the walls of the fort, enticing as it might seem, is not a tenable one. Should the civilian laborers not venture forth to cut and gather the hay that sustains the livestock within the fort, their means of both sustenance and mobility will be markedly compromised. And so, just after sunrise, a group of 30 men, composed of 21 soldiers and 9 civilians, make its nerve-rattling 2.5-mile commute to the hayfield in the Bigfoot Valley, where their day's work of harvesting lays ahead of them. As the laborers set about their work, the soldiers take their places on guard. The soldiers, members of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry and under the command of Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, split their force of 21 men between the hilltops surrounding the hayfield and the improvised corral-turned-fort that is to serve as shelter for the soldiers and civilians alike should an attack occur. The fort, more aptly described by one source as a fortified corral, has been constructed on the left bank of Warman Creek, roughly 40 feet from the stream bed. It measures roughly 100 feet by 60 feet and consists of upright posts sunk into the ground at 6-foot intervals. Horizontally attached to these are heavy poles, tied off to the vertical poles and interlaced with green willow branches. At best, under actual duress, the fortification will provide little in the way of cover, but it is certainly better than the alternative of being caught in the open. Though undeniably unnerved by the austerity and peril of their current location, the haycutters are still motivated by the repressive heat of the day that will soon become their second most formidable enemy. Thus, they are making a concerted effort to cut as much of the waist-high grass as possible, using mule-drawn hay mowers popularized in the last few decades. Suddenly, the plodding of the mules, the calls of the drivers, and the burring of the cutting blades are drowned out by the sound of gunfire and the cries of the guards stationed on the hilltops. As the soldiers call out to their cohorts in the fort and make their way frantically to the confines of the ad hoc structure, the laborers in the field are unable to fully discern what they are saying, but the meaning behind their actions is instantly all too clear. Native warriors have been spotted, and presumably in large numbers due to the panic of the rapidly retreating soldiers, and now every one of them are in very real danger. The men in the field drop their harvesting tools and make a sprint for the confines of the wooden-walled fort. As they run, they repeatedly look over their shoulders to what is a sight perhaps even more frightful than they had initially imagined. A large force of anywhere between 500 to 800 Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors now floods over the ridges of the surrounding hilltops in a veritable torrent of humanity and horseflesh. As the warriors rumble towards them, their bright war paint, feathers, gleaming weapons, and piercing cries present a sight that has haunted virtually all of the Americans' nightmares for weeks now. They had, time and again, heard the bone-chilling accounts of those soldiers who had found the unfortunate remains of the dead at the site of the Fetterman massacre, and had, to a man, often wondered if they might suffer the same fate themselves. But now, of course, the spectacle before them presents a very immediate and very mortal threat. Before many of the Americans, both soldiers and civilians, can join their comrades already defending the fort, some of the charging Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe are able to flank the fort from the side opposite the hayfield, even managing to occupy some of the rifle pits dug just outside the hastily constructed walls. From behind these walls, the defenders fight ferociously, firing off an initial volley from their new Springfield Model 1866 trapdoor rifles. This new loading system, as opposed to the previous practice of loading the weapon through the muzzle, allows the soldiers to fire up to 15 to 20 rounds per minute, roughly 5 to 6 times the firing rate of their previous weapons. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors, however, have no idea that this advantage exists. Their strategy, as the attacking force, is to endure the first volley and to, after incurring any initial losses, eventually isolate and overwhelm this group of trespassers, just as they had done to the command of Captain Fetterman and countless others in the preceding months. But the initial volley cuts the charge into 2 separate advancing sections, with one group approaching from the west and the other from the east. And now, a pitched battle ensues, with the charging warriors pouring arrows into the confines of the fortified corral, all while exhorting their war cries in an effort that at times overtakes the cacophonous roar of the Springfield rifles. The first minutes of the battle unfold in rapid succession, in a mix of chaos and confusion, as the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe war chiefs urge on their younger cohorts, and Lieutenant Sternberg steadfastly takes his position, standing over his men who now lie prone and firing as he calmly encourages them and directs their fire. The veteran of several engagements, Sternberg refuses to take cover and fires his revolver while standing, fully exposed to the enemy. While this action is clearly brave, it is also exceedingly ill-advised in high plains warfare, and within minutes, the 30-year-old lieutenant falls dead from a shot to the head from one of the attacking warriors. Seeing the dire nature of the situation rapidly growing worse with the loss of their formal leadership, a civilian named Don A. Colvin now takes charge, directing the young soldiers not to follow their lieutenant's example, but to continue their rate of resolute fire from behind any and all cover they can procure. Another soldier, a private named Nairn, is also shot and killed by the attacking warriors. Eventually, though, the initial attack is driven back. Now, as the main force of warriors withdraws to coalesce and recalibrate, several individual warriors take up positions amongst the willows in the creek, from where they incessantly pepper the soldiers with pot shots. For the remainder of the morning and into the afternoon, the two sides trade shots, doing little in the way of consequential damage, but making retreat to Fort C.F. Smith virtually impossible. As the day drags on, consternation amongst both soldier and civilian pinned down inside the hay fort begins to grow. For reasons that will never be made explicitly clear, no relief force has yet been mounted from Fort C.F. Smith in order to aid their comrades in distress. Many worry that they will die here, in this barren hayfield so far from their homes. Others worry that worse, they will be taken captive and made to suffer the same fate as that of Fetterman's men the previous winter. Meanwhile, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe, although having killed the opposing commander, are themselves reeling. Several have been killed in the initial charge, and all are dismayed by the capabilities of the soldiers' new rapid-fire weapons. The decision is now made that if the warriors cannot wrest the soldiers from their defensive works in a head-on charge, they will set fire to the wooden confines and smoke them out. Soon, the soldiers lying prone behind what little cover the wooden railing and lattice work provides are made aware that their brief respite from the fight is over by way of dozens of flaming arrows falling about the dried grass that surrounds the fort. Behind the screen of smoke and flames, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors make daring charges forward in order to rescue their fallen comrades and recover their dead. One Private Lockhart, a young soldier defending the fort, gives the following first-hand account. Fire came in rolling billows, like the waves of the ocean, the Indians whooping behind. When it arrived within 20 feet of the barricade, it stopped, as though arrested by a supernatural power. The flames arose to a perpendicular height of at least 40 feet, made 1 or 2 undulating movements, and were extinguished with a spanking slap. The wind, the succeeding instant, carried the smoke of the smoldering grass from the providentially saved encampment. After an initial charge in order to recover their comrades, the native warriors again make a vicious attack on the fort itself, raining down bullets and arrows upon the defenders while again taking significant casualties themselves. However, in this attack, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe managed to mortally wound J.G. Hollister and inflict another wound on Sergeant Norton. Again, the battle devolves into a sniping match, with each side reluctant to make any major move. As the scorching summer sun reaches its noontime apex, both factions are exhausted from both the heat and the intensity of combat. A momentary lull in fighting occurs, with each side seizing the opportunity to stock up on water and tend to their wounded. As they wait on yet another attack they are all but certain will soon come, the soldiers and civilians ensconced inside the Hayfield Fort dig into their positions, and each man ensures he is amply supplied with both water and ammunition. Soon, another charge comes. Again, the blood-curdling war cries of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe fill the air, as the brave warriors make yet another charge, in hopes of finally overrunning the Hayfield Fort. But this time, the defenders, now with their more entrenched positions and with a boost in their collective morale from being able to restock their drinking water, offer up their most vociferous defense yet. Their repeating rifles are again able to inflict significant damage on the attacking warriors. Their first attack after the lull in fighting is repulsed, but the warriors soon regroup and make yet another charge. On this second charge, George Duncan manages to gravely wound a charging warrior. This warrior's fall alone seems to bring the entire attacking force to a near instantaneous halt. The attacking warriors now retreat, scooping up their wounded comrade on their egress and again disappearing over the hilltops. It is speculated amongst the defenders that perhaps the attacking warrior is a medicine man or chief. Perhaps, they hope, that will be the last attack of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe. Their own ammunition is beginning to run low, and the lack of reinforcements is again beginning to dampen their hopes of escape. Unwilling to hedge their bets on the native warriors having retreated for good, though, civilian Colvin leads an effort to reinforce the southern wall of the Hayfield Fort. The defenders are again met with the sight of an oncoming horde of mighty native warriors, themselves exhausted, incensed, and fearful. This time, the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe attack on foot, making a mad dash from the south towards the newly reinforced wall. The cry goes out amongst the men defending the Hayfield Fort to hold their fire until the attacking force has crossed the river and fully made their way out of the brush and into the open few yards of territory between the river and the southern wall of the fort. Finally, civilian Colvin opens fire, soon followed by the rest of the defenders, who in turn follow their shots with reloading and firing in rapid succession. Again, what is believed by the men in the fort to be a chief is killed in one of the volleys. Several of his warrior cohorts also fall, most dead or mortally wounded. The desperate attack is quickly repulsed, and seeing an opening in the weakened Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe forces, Private Bradley volunteers to take one of the 3 mules that has survived the fight and make a ride to CF Fort to make a desperate plea for reinforcements. With several warriors trailing him the entire way, Private Bradley miraculously makes his way into the confines of Fort C.F. Smith, with his attackers only several dozen yards behind him. When he arrives, he is informed that Company G, under the command of Colonel Bradley, no relation, has just moved out in order to reinforce the men at the Hayfield Fort. Learning of the full severity of the situation at the Hayfield Fort, a Company H, under the command of Lieutenant Fenton, is ordered to reinforce Company G, taking with them one of the fort's mountain howitzers, a small but formidable field cannon. The reinforcements reach the Hayfield Fort just as the sun is beginning to set. On their way into the fort, they had fought the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe with intermittent skirmishing and pot shots. Now, as the officers take stock of the gruesome scene of dead, wounded, and traumatized men, the men continue to snipe with warriors hidden in the brush line across the riverbank. With darkness looming, the need is rapidly becoming imminent to move back to Fort C.F. Smith, lest they all be trapped here overnight. Of the 22 mules that had made their way to the Hayfield Fort that morning, only 3 remain alive. This means that only 2 of the wagons at the Hayfield Fort can be used to transport the dead and wounded back to Fort C.F. Smith. Finally, after the wagons are loaded and the wounded are made ready to move, Lieutenant Colonel Brown orders the mountain howitzer brought forth and the remaining warriors are soon scattered with a few powerful blasts from the short-barreled artillery weapon with a notoriously cacophonous roar. The retreating force now makes their way back to Fort C.F. Smith, still skirmishing and taking potshots at warriors hidden in the brush and rolling hills. At one point in the 2-mile trek, the mountain howitzer is again made ready and fired upon pursuing warriors spotted on a bluff. Finally, at roughly 8:30 p.m., the rescue force, as well as the Hayfield Fort defenders, make their way back into the confines of Fort C.F. Smith. For the men at Fort C.F. Smith, their long, difficult, deadly day is over. 3 amongst their ranks, Lieutenant Sternberg, Private Navin, and J.G. Hollister, have been killed, and several more are wounded. But now, finally safe in the confines of the fort, the men can breathe a sigh of long-awaited relief. For the men at this remote post in Montana, it seems as though the whole world has been condensed into the area between their present location and the Hayfield Fort. As each man finally falls asleep that night, they are thankful that their fighting, at least for now, is done. But the very next day, on August 2, 1867, another contingent of civilian laborers and soldiers on a work detail roughly 80 miles away at Fort Phil Kearny in Wyoming will fight for their lives against perhaps an even larger, more desperate force of attacking Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapahoe warriors in what will be the last major engagement of Red Cloud's War. It will be known to history as the Wagon Box Fight, and seen in many records as an inseparable event from the Hayfield Fight. However, the story of the Wagon Box Fight and the conclusion of Red Cloud's War are other stories for other times. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.